All right, Alexander, we need to talk about Iran and Joe Biden and the way he's handling it. The Biden administration and how they're handling things with Iran. It looks like that we may not be getting a resolution, a JCPOA back to the table type of thing. And Iran seems to be, I don't want to say they're digging their heels because they didn't pull out of anything. They didn't, and when you step back, they didn't do anything wrong. And they're just basically saying, look, we're going to continue down this path that you guys pulled out of. And it looks like that Biden doesn't, and this doesn't surprise me. It looks like the Biden White House, they don't have the diplomatic chops to come to some sort of resolution with Iran. So I think we're kind of heading towards a given course. What do you think?
I think that's exactly right. I think you put your finger on exactly what the situation is. We have a US administration which is drifting. On the one hand, Biden said, and this is the policy that he announced during the election and before, which is that he would take the US back into the JCPOA. This is this agreement that Obama negotiated with Iran, whereby the Iranians would limit the amount of enriched nuclear fuel that they would have and would allow inspections by the International Atomic Energy Authority. And in return, the US would lift sanctions. And Trump pulled out of that. He said it wasn't good enough. He said it didn't include Iran's involvement in other Middle Eastern countries, and it didn't address the problems created by Iran's ballistic missile systems. And the Iranians said, well, in that case, we're going to start enriching uranium. And they are enriching uranium, and Iran's supreme leader, who is different from its president, but its supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, has now said that Iran might actually continue to enrich uranium up to a level of 60% if the United States doesn't lift the sanctions and rejoin the JCPOA. And Biden and the administration have come up with this very strange demand, at least I have to say I find it strange in this context, in which they are saying, well, we're not going to rejoin the JCPOA unless and until Iran stops enriching uranium and gives up all the uranium which it has enriched, which in effect means that we are at a standoff. It's an absolutely classical standoff, whereas a more skilled diplomat or groups of diplomats would have got together with the Iranians and would have agreed a joint timetable in which there would have been, a staged withdrawal from the sanctions on the part of the United States, a staged giving up of nuclear fuel by the Iranians, and you would have found your way back to that position which you said that you wanted. Instead, we have Biden making demands of the Iranians, which the Iranians are simply refusing to comply with. And as you say, the Iranians say we are under no obligation to comply with these things, with these demands, because it was the US that decided to pull out of the JCPOA. It is the classic example of an administration that doesn't know how to do things and doesn't really understand how to conduct diplomacy in an effective way. I would add that there is a time window for this which is closing. In June, Iran holds parliamentary elections. Those are not open elections as they are in the West. The parties that can contest them, the people who can contest them, are carefully filtered. But they are a reflection to some extent of the political opinion in Iran. And it is widely accepted that if those elections happen, the Iranian government will be recalibrated and you will have far more hardline people in charge as of June who have always considered the JCPOA a bad thing and want to press ahead with nuclear enrichment. So the time window is, there's still time, but it's not indefinite. And if you really want to sort this out, you need to sort it out quickly. And that's precisely what the Biden administration is not doing.
Yeah, the Biden administration is way in over their head. There's no way they're going to figure this out. That's my opinion. And then you have the EU. What does the EU do? Because the EU is also just run by a bunch of buffoons. I don't have much faith in the EU as well. So what does the EU do? What's Russia's role? And then, of course, what does Israel do if Iran continues to proceed down this road? Because you have an Israel that also doesn't really get along with Biden. They don't really, Netanyahu doesn't really like Biden at all. So what does Israel do? And what's the US's influence on that end as well, if they even have any influence of Israel at this point? Where do all these pieces fit?
Well, indeed, let's start with the EU. The EU formally backs the JCPOA, but has done absolutely nothing since Trump left it to keep it alive. I mean, they made all kinds of promises to the Iranians that they would continue trade, that they'd set up all these financial mechanisms. None of that actually happened. And the Iranians have absolutely lost any confidence in the EU, which they might once have had. The EU has now offered to mediate between the US and Iran to try to come back to get, to help the US get back into the JCPOA. But they're also sort of saying that they want the JCPOA renegotiated in some way in order to, adapt to US concerns. The Iranians won't agree to that. So this mediation exercise is pointless. The Iranians don't trust the mediator. And why anyway does the US need the EU to mediate? I mean, what is the point of the EU acting as mediator? So in effect, the EU is doing absolutely nothing. What are the Russians and the Chinese doing? Well, the Russians and the Chinese don't want Iran to develop nuclear weapons, but at the same time, they're quietly supporting Iran. And I think that's an important thing to say, whereas previously, the Russians and the Chinese had been prepared to take a sort of even-handed role between the US and Iran and try to edge Iran towards compromising with the US. This time, because of their own issues with the US and with the EU, they're not prepared to do that. So they're coming up with statements about, Iran needs to be, reasonable, but they're not actually doing anything to put pressure on Iran. On the contrary, they are increasingly helping Iran economically, especially China, by the way. And this is becoming ever more evident, and it explains partly why Iran feels that it can withstand sanctions pressure and is taking a stronger line than it might otherwise have done. What are the other countries in the Middle East going to do? You're absolutely right. Netanyahu has a difficult relationship with Biden. They've only very recently spoken. They don't get on. And the other major player in the Middle East, which is Saudi Arabia, apparently Biden is taking the first steps, or so many people think. Maybe I should say the Biden administration seems to be taking the first steps to try to leverage MBS, the Saudi Crown Prince, out of power. That's what some people are saying, and some of the first indications are looking at that. But the result is a tense relationship with Saudi Arabia also. The Saudis and the Israelis, if they feel that the United States is going to edge back into the JCPOA and disregard their concerns, as it did when Obama was president, they are perfectly capable of taking action of their own. Certainly Israel is, and the Israelis will know if they do that, that there will be many people in the United States, including people within the Biden administration, who will back them. And that they also know that the presidency, Joe Biden, is not in a strong position to take strong action to restrain them. So we have drift. We have a drift where the United States isn't sealing the deal fast, as it could do. It isn't taking strong steps to reassure and at the same time restrain its regional allies, Israel and Saudi Arabia, as it could do. On the contrary, it's got tense relations with one, which is Israel, and it seems to be meddling in the affairs of the other, which is Saudi Arabia, which is bound to result in a pushback there. And of course, the EU is doing nothing, and the Chinese and the Russians are watching and waiting and quietly backing Iran. The stage is set, quite possibly, for a major confrontation to happen, possibly in June, when, as I said, the government in Iran is likely to become much more hardline than the one that the government is at this present moment now. So we're drifting towards a very bad situation. And when Donald Trump was in charge, as we remember and as we discussed, he was always there to put the brakes on if things really looked like they were going to get out of hand. You remember that this time last year, we were talking about, and it was proved to be true, quiet negotiations that were happening between Donald Trump and the Iranians, and there was also discussions between Donald Trump and the Iranians during the Soleimani affair. There's nothing like that apparently happening now. There is no one in Washington who's able to slam on the brakes if things get out of hand, and there is no one either to negotiate his way round and find the way through, getting past all the various diplomatic obstacles that one needs to see if one is to get a peace agreement, a return to the JCPOA, which works. So we have the most dangerous situation of all, one where instead of purposeful action being taken by a joined-up administration with the president in full and active charge, we are drifting into a possible conflict with no one there to take control.
Yeah, it's a runaway train, and there's no one manning the damn thing. Biden is just out to lunch. It's completely obvious. It's clear. Then you have Kamala Harris, who's probably couldn't find Iran on a map. I'm positive that she couldn't find Iran on a map. So this is a terrible situation that we're drifting towards.
Absolutely, I completely agree, and it's not getting the attention it needs. And the other thing, by the way, that Biden isn't doing is, of course, the administration isn't doing, is because they don't really have a clear policy, they're not preparing the ground for whatever step they're going to take within the United States itself. So we see all sorts of people pushing and pulling in different directions within the US, and a US itself which is drifting, and it's a runaway train, and the driver is fast asleep.
A final question. Outside of diplomatic channels, there's really nothing anyone can do to stop Iran from doing what it's going to do.
Absolutely,
there really isn't.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right, because
there is no military solution to this. That's my question.
No, you're completely correct. We discussed this recently in our last live stream. In our live stream. You can't realistically invade or conquer or occupy Iran. It's a large mountainous country with a sophisticated military up to a certain level, fairly sophisticated military. It's simply not like Iraq, which you can take over. It's not comparable to that at all. So there is no real military answer to this. What you can have, though, is the Israelis, for example, launching strikes against Iran, which the Iranians might respond to. And then you could see a major escalation, not just between Iran and Israel, but across the whole Middle East. And then we would have a crisis of a sort that it's difficult to imagine the scale of, and difficult to see how it would be brought back under control. But that's what we're drifting towards. I mean, I was never worried that this would happen. I know a lot of people were, but I was never personally worried that this would happen whilst Donald Trump was in charge, because I was always sure that in the end, he knew when to stop. And he did. But with Biden, I'm not so sure. And you can see that the inability of the Biden administration to get its act together over the JCPOA is a sign of how disorganized things in Washington are. And it's a very bad sign for the future.
Yeah. You can see that live stream conversation that we had actually, that call in. I put it up on another channel called Duran Call-In Show. So guys, look that up and subscribe to that channel. I'm putting all the call-in questions on that channel. So it's really cool. You can just, isolate the call-in questions and you can watch those videos. So look for that in the links down below. Real quick, Alexander, going back to that conversation we had on that call-in, on that live stream. When dealing with Iran, the thing with Iran is that they have so many asymmetric ways to deal with a head-on attack, a missile attack or something along those lines, which would just, it would just cause all kinds of trouble in the region on so many different levels. And that's what makes Iran such a tricky adversary for the U.S. or Israel, is they have so many different asymmetric ways to deal with a head-on attack. Do you want to address what I just said?
Absolutely. I mean, of course, they've got their friends in Lebanon, Hezbollah, and all those who are on Israel's borders, and who are perfectly capable of lobbing missiles into Israel, as they did before in 2006. They're perfectly capable of doing that again. They've got all kinds of friends and proxies and Shia militias in places like Iraq, where they could be activated to target the US troops there. They've got some kind of relationship with Houthis, which we don't completely fully realize and understand. And there's also large numbers of Shia people in Saudi Arabia, and they could activate the Houthis and all these people in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere to destabilize Saudi Arabia. And of course, last but not least, they can take all sorts of steps to try to close the Persian Gulf to oil traffic. They could try and block the Straits of Hormuz. This is a time when there's already an oil shortage and oil prices are rising. An oil shortage, by the way, which the Trump administration is making worse by closing the Keystone pipeline and stopping all the fracking that's going on, or taking steps to slow down fracking.
The Biden administration.
The Biden administration, I'm sorry, yes. The Biden administration is doing all of those things. So all of that is happening at the moment in the US, and oil prices are rising. And of course, we have an economic recession around the world, and we absolutely do not need, at this moment in time, a conflict in the Middle East with the Straits of Hormuz closed and the danger of an added oil price explosion. I mean, that would be a disaster for the world economy in general. So, they've got all kinds of levers they can pull and buttons they can press. And of course, they've also got now, as they demonstrated previously, they got the means, the Iranians have got the means to launch missile strikes with great deal of precision, far greater precision than anybody expected, across much of the Middle East. They can launch those missiles from Iran itself. They can launch them against US bases, and there is no real and effective counter to those missiles. When they last did it, when the Iranians last did it, again, they acted with some restraint. They made sure that the Americans knew which bases they were going to attack and launch the missiles against, and the US troops were put in barracks and kept out of harm's way. But many of them apparently suffered psychological injuries as a result. If we have an actual, genuine Iranian attack on US missile installation or US bases in the Middle East with Iranian missiles, well, heavens knows, I mean, it would be a disaster with incalculable consequences. So this is a powder keg, and nobody looking at it should imagine otherwise or take on the kind of foolish risks that some people in Washington are taking, and which other people in Washington are allowing the US to drift towards. That's a perilous situation in the Middle East. I'm not saying you give the Iranians everything they want. You could do all sorts of things, but you can't simply just drift and allow these things to deteriorate in the way that they are.
All right. We'll leave it there. Alexander Brett-Kurz, thank you very much. Guys, go to the Duran shop, pick up some merch. Look for my channel, look for Alexander's channel. Look for the call-in shows as well, that channel as well. And PayPal, Patreon, Subscribestar, and Bitcoin. That helps out this channel a whole lot.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And look up our shop, our wonderful things there, our magic mugs, our t-shirts, our hats, our hoodies, and our sweatshirts. And join us again for our next broadcast, and have a wonderful day.
All right. Take care, everybody.